Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel and to the next video in our Scotland mini-series. This week we explore the once remains of a truly great medieval monastery of Scotland. These substantial ruins of a 12th century Premonstratensian abbey stand in a beautiful setting on the River Tweed, offering us a tranquil overview of the Scottish borders. And as you wander around this remarkably complete medieval ruin, you're able to grasp the appeal of monastic life. So join us as we discover Dryburgh Abbey. Beyond a scattering of weathered tombstones lie the reddish remains of the church, the chapter house and cloister. The path that leads to the grounds takes you past some huge trees and to some gravestones that are interesting to take the time to look at. Unique amongst the local abbeys, most of Dryburgh's church has been lost to the ravages of war and fire, while the domestic architecture, the dormitories of the monks, still remains in place. Over the centuries, the Scottish borders had a number of impressive and great working abbeys, parts of which remain today at Melrose, Jedburgh and Kelso Abbey. But Dryburgh is unusual in so much as what remains are the domestic quarters rather than the church itself, giving us a better and more believable insight into the lives of the monks who worshipped and lived here. The quiet surroundings was exactly what the monks of Dryburgh Abbey required, which was not always true of the other monasteries that would normally go after wealth and political influence. But here, hidden contemplation was the prime currency. The first building we come across is the north transept. It's here that you can start to see the original structure. But the main focal point is the impressive chapels that lay to rest the souls of Sir Walter Scott and Field Marshal Earl Haig, amongst others. Field Marshal Haig's gravestone is in the same style as those used in the large Walgrave cemeteries, established just after World War I. The Field Marshal's ancestors came to the Scottish borders with Hugh de Morville in the 12th century. It's a really beautiful sight to be laid to peace. Next to this is where Walter Scott is buried alongside his wife, Charlotte, and her son Walter, as well as his son-in-law John Gibson Lockhart. Sir Walter Scott was one of the most popular and significant writers of the 19th century. He was also an important figure in political life and helped foster an interest in Scottish culture and history both abroad and within his native Scotland. Scott was descended from the Haliburton family, who once owned the Dryburgh site. The north transept really is the best preserved part of the Abbey Church, and it's quite the remarkable place to be seeing these stones and all of the intricate carvings that are surrounding it. And it's also a beautiful place for Scott and his family to finally rest. He was allowed to be buried at Dryburgh Abbey by right of his ancestors, the Haliburtons. For most of the rest of the church, you have to really rely on the foundations and imagination. The vaulted roof of the north transept is decorated with elaborately carved stone bosses, and scratched into the floor is a board for playing the popular medieval game of Nine Men's Morris. Living quarters have fared better, and it's possible to wander in and out of the dormitory, the library, the cloister, the warming house and the refectory, all which still survive, and it's just amazing to walk around. Founded in 1150, the church was the main house of the French order of Premonstratensian canons, but it generally offered a quiet life ideal for the resident monks right up until the Reformation, despite suffering 4 attacks over the centuries by English armies. It was founded by Hugh de Morville for the canons from Alnwick Priory in Northumberland. De Morville was the Constable of Scotland and Lord of the Lauderdale. He had joined Prince David in France and helped him establish himself as King David I of Scotland. But despite his regal Scottish titles, he was actually a Norman lord, with his roots based very much in England. So it's not actually that unusual that he invited English canons to populate his brand new abbey. There is a cynical view that during this period, rich landowners endowed abbeys to make sure of a constant stream of prayer said on their behalf, and so this was to secure their place in the afterlife. Hugh passed away here at Dryburgh in 1162. It's worth noting that Hugh de Morville should not be confused with his son, also called Hugh, who helped murder Archbishop Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral in 1170. The abbey's church is constructed partly from attractive pink sandstone. The presbytery is particularly impressive, but many other sections are razed to the ground. Instead, and unusually, the best preserved parts of the abbey are the extensive domestic quarters, plus the impressive dormitories, the cloisters and a warming house. Despite having been set on fire 3 times, the impressive chapter house features paintwork that dates back to its construction, and today boasts some of the best Gothic architecture in Scotland. Whilst we explore the outer buildings and around the chapter house and the communal buildings of all of the monks, I'll share with you a slice of their daily routine that was made up of religious services, household functions, agricultural duties, and copying books. The monks would wake in the early hours of the morning, when the canons were wakened by the dormitory bell. They would then have to head to the church for the first service of the day, following of which they could just return to bed. After this, at 6 a.m, a prime service would be held, where the canons were reawakened and summoned into church for Mass. It's here that they would remain in private prayers until the bell would announce the daily meeting inside of the chapter house. The community would then all assemble in the cloister and proceed into the chapter house, where a lesson from the rules of the order would be read aloud. Following on from this meeting, the canons would proceed in pairs back to the church for singing of hymns before High Mass was performed at midday. The community then ate around 1 p.m, where only 2 dishes were served, except for special occasions when an additional sweet dish was served. If somebody was late for the meal, unless he had a good enough reason, he would have to sit at the most remote table and with no wine or ale. After the dinner, some of the canons would rest, whilst others conversed till 3 p.m, when again the canons proceeded to church for another service, after which the community were required to wash their hands and wait in the cloister until they were summoned to the refectory to drink. At 6 p.m, the canons would attend vespers, or evening prayers, before following a light supper, and then bed around 7 p.m. For bedtime, there were no sheets on the dormitory beds, and the canons would be required to sleep in their habits. The Premonstratensians operated a stricter and purer form of the rule of St. Augustine, supplemented with ideas drawn from the Cistercian order. It was a life of tremendous austerity, abstinence, fasting and mortification, all dedicated to the contemplation of God. This type of devotion is apparent in the fact that the abbey only had one single, small fireplace to warm the monks throughout the long, harsh Scottish winters, really showcasing the harsh and austere life that the monks would have to go through to show their dedication to their faith and order. The remains of the abbey were acquired by the Earl of Buchan in 1786. He worked hard to preserve what was left and built within and around it a large formal garden. Like many early antiquarians, he couldn't resist the temptation to improve the ruins. An inscribed date of 1150 owes more to him than the original builders. He also built the monument to the south of the abbey to commemorate its foundation by Hugh de Morville. Inside this vault are the remains of David Stewart and his family, and the busts of them on the sides, which is quite incredible to see. Originally though, this vault room was part of the abbey's parlour. In the next room along, which is now closed off, you can explore the fantastic displays of carven masonries that displayed and demonstrated the masons' creativeness and their craftsmanship too. Some of the designs in the room were carved into sandstone and include flowers, leaves, St Andrew and lizards, which were often used to represent the devil. Hot on the heels of the marauding English came the Reformation of 1560. At the time there were only 8 monks or canons still at the abbey, plus the sub-prior. They were allowed to live out their lives at Dryburgh, but had all died by the 1600s. The beautiful chapter house was perhaps the second most important space in the abbey. It is especially well preserved. Inside of this 13th century chapter house, you're still able to see the remnants of medieval painted wall plaster. The painted plaster is a very rare example of 13th century art, and most of it is preserved behind the clear glass panels at the back of the room. Also inside this room, although weathered, are the carved outlines of 2 coffins, discovered during the Erskine's restoration work. The peaceful life of the canons at Dryburgh was disturbed in 1320 when a canon brother named Marcus punched the abbot. For this serious offence he was banished from the abbey. Much worse was to come just 2 years later in 1322 when the armies of Edward II retreated from a reverse against the Scots, heard the abbey's bells ringing in the distance. According to legend, the army turned aside from the route of its march and sacked the abbey, setting fire to the monastic buildings and carrying off whatever loot they could grab. Robert the Bruce picked up the tab for the damage, but the abbey was destroyed once again by Richard II as he swept through the borders in punishment for Scots raids on the north of England. Dryburgh was never as prestigious or as wealthy as the 3 major border abbeys at Melrose, Kelso and Jedburgh, but it lasted for over 400 years in this peaceful spot by the Tweed. What emerged from the rebuilding process that probably took another 100 years was an even bigger and better abbey than before, despite further destruction by another English army in 1385. But the completed abbey of the 1400s would have only seen a further century of active use. The end effectively came on the 4th of November in 1544, when some 700 English troops mounted a raid across the border, destroying both Dryburgh Abbey and the nearby town of Dryburgh too. In the 16th century, a woman in a house near to Dryburgh Abbey fell madly in love with a monk. They began a secret love affair, but in time the abbot found out about their forbidden love. The monk was sentenced to death for breaking his strict religious vows. Her lover was hanged in view of her house. The woman, whose name has been lost to history, was so distraught that she committed suicide by throwing herself off the nearby bridge and into the River Tweed. She drowned, but in death her spirit haunts the bridge, and sometimes the new building of the Dryburgh Abbey House Hotel. She appears as a grey lady ghost, and sightings of the grey lady ghost at Dryburgh are more frequent during unrest at the Dryburgh Abbey Hotel, such as during renovation work. Another story is of a legendary spirit that lived at Dryburgh Abbey named Fat Lips. The spirit was connected to a hermit woman who took up residence in a vault amongst the ruins of the abbey, sometime after the 1745 Jacobite uprising. The woman had claimed that the spirit would tidy her room while she was away, and it would keep the cell that she lived in dry by stamping out moisture away from the ground with his heavy ironclad boots. As you all know by now, we love the folklore and the mystical tales, and Fat Lips is a really interesting and surprisingly positive tale from what we normally hear about. Nevertheless, Dryburgh is bound to have some spirits lingering and wanting to tell their stories. So that's it for this week. It's been great to be able to experience this abbey, and we really hope it gives people an idea of how stunning the Scottish borders really are, and the kind of places you can expect to visit if you're in the area. The calming vibes here speak volumes. It's a wonderful explore. So if you've enjoyed the video, please be sure to hit that like button, click on the notification bell so you never miss a video, and consider subscribing to the channel or clicking the join button to be a member of the channel. We want to say a big thank you to our Patreons and to our channel members for their support. So we'll see you in the next one. Till next time.